If you've ever waited for someone who promised to return, this story is about you. She wasn't extraordinary like the movies exaggerate. She was ordinary in the most human sense, and that was her strength. She loved intensely, not dramatically with presence, not conditionally, giving herself completely because she believed that love was a daily choice. When she loved, she didn't calculate losses. She trusted. Their relationship was built on simple things: shared silences, routine laughter, unhurried mornings, a love that lived in everyday gestures and not in grand declarations. That's why it lasted. One night, she waited in the rain longer than she should have, convincing herself that soaked clothes meant nothing compared to a broken promise. She checked her phone repeatedly, knowing there would be no notification, but still hoping she was wrong. At some point, she kept a small memento, without knowing why. A photo, a message, a moment frozen in time. And deep down, without admitting it, she wondered how many people were doing the same thing at that moment, clinging to something that no longer responded. Tell me, from where in the world are you watching this story? There are promises that aren't broken loudly. They simply dissipate in silence, leaving behind the pain of waiting. They told her he would return, not with a date, not with certainty, but with words that sounded strong enough to lean on. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into years, and time became the silent villain that stole hope without asking permission. Every night was the same. The instinctive glance at the phone, the reflex to check a message that never arrived, the memory of a voice that once said, "Wait for me." She kept a photo hidden where no one could see it, not because it still hurt, but because letting go felt like a betrayal. How long can someone believe before belief becomes a habit? How many promises do we protect even after they cease to protect us? Somewhere between longing and resignation, a question remains unspoken. What if some promises aren't broken, only postponed, testing how long the heart is willing to endure the wait? In the beginning, their love didn't arrive with a bang. There were no exaggerated declarations nor eternal promises made too soon. It simply instayed. Like someone who sits beside you without asking permission, but makes it seem like they've always been there. It was a light love, the kind that doesn't tire you. Conversations that didn't need important topics. Silences that didn't bother anyone. Laughter in simple moments, as if happiness didn't require grand scenarios to exist. She realized she was in love, not in a grand moment, but in a small detail. The way he remembered what she said. The coffee she liked weaker. The fear she had of losing the one she loved. The smile she gave when she pretended to be okay, even when she wasn't. He paid attention. And that, more than any "I love you," took root. Because in the beginning, true love manifests itself in almost invisible gestures. It's when someone waits for you to cross the street. When he texts just to see if you arrived safely. When he looks at you as if he's listening not only to your words, but also to your silences. She felt she could be herself, without rehearsing answers, without putting on better versions of herself. With him, there was no need to impress. There was the rare tranquility of simply existing. And that feeling, of not needing to defend yourself, is one of the first clues that the heart has found a safe place. Being with him was like coming home after a long day. It didn't matter where they were. Home wasn't an address. It was a presence. Many people confuse love with intensity, but what they had was constancy. And constancy creates trust. Trust creates surrender. Surrender creates bonding. That's how love truly grows, not like a wildfire, but like a flame that warms without destroying. She found herself thinking about the future naturally, not like someone making desperate plans, but like someone who simply believes that tomorrow makes sense if the other person is there. It was a tranquil certainty, without anxiety, as if the heart were saying, "It's good here." And perhaps the most dangerous thing about love in the beginning is precisely that. It doesn't warn you when it's conquering you. It doesn't shout. It whispers. And when you realize it, it has already become part of your routine, your peace, your emotional identity. That's why, when everything seemed right, it truly seemed that way. There were no clear signs that something would go wrong. There were no warnings. There were no rehearsed goodbyes. There were only two people living an honest present, believing, as so many other people believe, that when something begins so genuinely it can only continue that way. And that's exactly why future pain hurts so much. Because before it hurt, this love was shelter. Before it became absence, it was presence. Before it became a promise, it was home. His departure didn't come as a sudden abandonment. It came disguised as necessity. Something that life imposes without asking for your opinion, like bills that come due or decisions that can no longer be postponed. Work, family, responsibility. Words that, when said with the right weight, sound irrefutable. He explained calmly. He didn't seem like someone running away. He seemed like someone torn. He said he needed to go to reorganize his own life, help those who depended on him, resolve pending issues that could no longer wait. He spoke as someone carrying guilt even before leaving. And she listened, trying to be mature, trying to love without selfishness, trying to understand that loving someone is also sometimes letting them go. The problem wasn't the departure, it was the promise. He held her hands as if he wanted to memorize the touch. He looked into her eyes for too long, that kind of look that precedes something important. And then he said, his voice firm enough to convince, but low enough to sound intimate, "I'll be back. This isn't goodbye. It's just a break." Promises have this strange power. They transform the future into something concrete. The instant he said that, the absence gained a deadline. The pain gained meaning. The waiting gained justification. It was no longer an end. It was an interval. The moment of farewell was etched in her memory like a photograph that time cannot erase. His scent mingled with the wind, the distant sound of cars passing by, indifferent to that decisive moment. Her heart raced as if her body knew something was about to break, even if her mind still believed. She tried to smile. He did too. Smiles that fooled no one but served as a shield against tears. The hug lasted longer than usual. It wasn't an ordinary hug. It was a squeeze of someone trying to keep the other inside. When he pulled away, she stood still, watching, hoping he would look back. And he did. That seemingly small detail was enough to strengthen the promise. Because whoever looks back seems like someone who intends to return. The human brain works like this. It clings to promises more than to evidence. Even when the facts say that the distance is long, that time is uncertain, that life often changes plans, the promise creates a comfortable narrative. She told herself, he hasn't gone away. He's just far away. And that's where everything changes. The promise not only kept the love alive, it postponed the grieving. It prevented detachment. It transformed absence into hope. Each day without him began to be counted not as a loss but as the approach of reunion. Without realizing it, that simple phrase became the emotional axis of her life. All future decisions, all tolerated silences, all swallowed pains were anchored in those 4 words. I will return. Because when someone promises to return, we don't prepare for abandonment. We prepare to wait. And waiting, when sustained by love and promise, doesn't seem like weakness. It seems like fidelity. She didn't know it yet, but at that exact moment when he left and left a promise in place of his body, destiny began to write the most painful part of the story. In the first days of absence, the silence doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in. The house remains the same, the objects stay in their places, but something invisible begins to weigh on the air. The space that was once occupied by messages, quick laughs, and constant presence is now filled with intervals too long to ignore. The phone remains on the table, the screen off, but the eyes return to it repeatedly, almost reflexively. The body still acts as if nothing has changed, preparing 2 coffees, waiting for footsteps in the hallway, recognizing sounds that don't exist. The mind tries to deny the impact, calling it a pause, a temporary interval, something that will soon be corrected. It is at this moment that silence begins to replace presence, not as an abrupt void, but as a shadow that grows slowly, occupying every corner without asking permission, teaching that absence also knows how to make noise. To avoid collapsing, hope becomes a routine. It is organized into small justifications, repeated like a silent mantra. He must be busy. It was a long day. He'll show up tomorrow. Each thought acts as an improvised bandage, holding back emotions that threaten to escape. The weight begins to have schedules, invisible rules, and internal promises of patience. The clock ticks, but the heart insists on remaining still in the last moment when everything still made sense. The memory of the farewell is edited by the mind, softened, reinterpreted, as if there were a secret clue that nothing is truly over. Maintaining hope ceases to be a choice and becomes a necessity, because admitting the opposite possibility would mean accepting too much pain too soon. Thus, the absence is disguised as lateness, and the emptiness gains the comfortable name of waiting. It is then that small signs begin to gain disproportionate weight. An old scene note, a minimal activity, a schedule similar to before. Everything becomes an indication, everything seems like an indirect message. The brain, accustomed to the presence, begins to work in emotional survival mode, searching for any fragment that confirms the narrative that something is still there. One day without a call is explained, 2 days are relativized, 3 days become a test of patience. He'll call later, ceases to be a phrase and becomes a daily promise made to oneself. Each night ends with the same expectation, and each morning begins again with the same internal argument. At this stage, the pain doesn't yet scream, but it organizes itself. It learns to wait together, sits beside, observes in silence, and prepares itself. Because the first days of absence don't break immediately, they only teach, slowly, what it's like to live without answers. When the waiting starts to hurt, time ceases to be neutral. Dates that were once just numbers on the calendar begin to carry a symbolic weight that is difficult to ignore. An anniversary approaches, a holiday arrives, a date that was yours passes by without warning, and nothing happens. There is no message, no explanation, no sign. The silence, which once seemed temporary, now takes shape and intention. Absence ceases to be interpreted as chance and begins to be felt as a choice. Each important date that passes without contact functions as a silent confirmation that something has profoundly changed, even without having been said aloud. The heart tries to minimize the impact, but the body feels it first. A tightness in the chest, a shorter breath, a strange feeling of celebrating something alone when it should be shared. The waiting, once sustained by hope, now begins to exact an emotional price. Unanswered messages accumulate like unanswered questions. The text is written, reread, edited, sent, and then ignored. The phone vibrates for other reasons but never for what truly matters. Each incorrect notification reinforces the correct absence. The mind revisits each word sent, searching for an invisible mistake, a wrong tone, a phrase that may have pushed them away. At the same time, the world around seems to insist on painful comparisons. Couples laughing in public, happy photos on social media, casual conversations about plans for two. Everything becomes a mirror, everything becomes a contrast. While others move on together, there is only waiting. The feeling is not one of envy, but of displacement, as if out of sync with the rhythm of normal life. The comparison is not chosen, it happens automatically, deepening the silent question. Why does it seem to continue with everyone else, but not here? Waiting for someone who promised to return is like leaving the door unlocked during a storm. At first, it seems like a gesture of trust. Then, it becomes vulnerability. The rain enters uninvited, the wind messes everything up, and yet the door remains open, because closing it would mean accepting that the promise was not kept. Each day of waiting exposes more of the inner self, wears down structures further, weakens what was once secure, The pain doesn't come from a single great disappointment, but from the sum of small, constant impacts. Hope remains, but now mixed with fear, frustration, and the feeling of protecting oneself from everything except one's own expectation. At this point, the waiting is no longer silent. It hurts. It tires. It begins to teach, even without words, that not every promise is fulfilled, and that some absences hurt precisely because they remained unresolved for too long. Disappointment arrives when the mind, exhausted from waiting, finally considers what previously seemed unthinkable. The promise, which sustained entire days, begins to lose its shape, like something that no longer breathes. It's not an immediate acceptance, it's a painful recognition, almost against one's own will. The possibility of abandonment arises first as an intrusive thought, then as a real hypothesis, until it transforms into a constant presence. At this point, hope no longer protects, it hurts. Each memory of what was said returns with double the weight, because now it carries the suspicion that perhaps it was never true. Accepting this possibility doesn't bring relief, it brings a fall. It's like realizing you've been holding on to something that was let go long ago, and the impact doesn't come from the loss itself, but from the delay in recognizing it. Anger appears mixed with love, creating an internal conflict difficult to explain. There is a desire to demand, to shout, to require answers, while at the same time there is still care, longing, and attachment. It's not pure hatred, it's accumulated emotional frustration, anger for having believed, for having waited, for having organized life around a promise that now seems empty. But alongside it remains the love that simply doesn't know how to disappear. This mixture generates confusion. Because there is no dominant feeling, there are several competing with each other. The mind oscillates between defending the one who left and condemning them, between justifying the silence and feeling betrayed by them. It is in this conflict that suffering reaches a deeper level, because there is no clear direction to channel the pain. Everything happens at the same time, without pause. It is then that guilt begins to turn inward. Was I not enough? Did I do something wrong? If I had been different, would he have stayed? Psychologically, abandoned people tend to blame themselves because it gives a false sense of control. If the guilt is internal, then perhaps the pain is explainable. Perhaps there is a logical reason for the abandonment, but this logic is cruel because it transforms the absence of the other into a personal failure. Every detail of the relationship is revisited as evidence against oneself. Gestures, words, silences. Everything becomes evidence of inadequacy. At this stage, the promise not only seems to have died, but takes with it self-esteem, emotional security, and confidence in one's own worth. The disappointment reaches its peak, not when the other disappears, but when the person begins to believe that they deserve to be left. Time passed not as an immediate remedy, but as an inevitable presence. In the beginning, each day seemed like a conscious effort to continue existing. Then the days began to happen without her realizing it. Not because the pain had gone away, but because the body learns to live with what the heart hasn't yet resolved. She understood, little by little, that waiting had become a silent way of hurting herself. There were no more scheduled dates, there were no more signs. The promise that once sustained her now weighed her down. And it was at this point, when hope began to tire, that something inside her needed to change. The healing process wasn't pretty. It didn't have motivational phrases or heroic decisions. It was made of small choices, getting up even without wanting to, answering messages, accepting invitations without enthusiasm. Real healing is almost never inspiring. It's functional. It's learning to live even when the heart is still lagging behind in relation to life. She created new habits not for pleasure, but out of necessity. She changed her routines, reorganized her house, filled time slots that previously belonged to waiting. She started walking alone, listening to different music, going to bed earlier. Each new habit was a discreet attempt to prove to herself that movement was still possible. There were days when she felt strong, others when a simple memory would shatter everything. A smell, a song, a place. The pain didn't follow a straight line. It came in waves. But unlike before, now she wasn't drowning. She was learning to float. At some point, she tried to love again, not because she had forgotten, but because she had understood that life doesn't pause for those who wait too long. She met good people, whole people, available people. But something always seemed out of place. It wasn't their fault. It was like trying to inhabit a new house carrying old furniture that no longer fit. Her heart still compared, still protected itself, still closed doors before even hearing who was knocking. Because a wounded heart doesn't break. It hardens before learning to beat again. This hardening isn't coldness. It's self-preservation. It's love defending itself from another fall. Over time, she stopped wondering if he would return. The question changed. It became, who am I now? And that question, though frightening, was liberating. Because rebuilding oneself isn't about going back to being who one was before. It's about accepting that the pain transformed something, and that it's okay not to be the same person. She became more selective, more silent, more aware of her own limits. She learned to recognize signs, to not give herself away too quickly, to not confuse absence with mystery. And without realizing it, she was becoming more whole than she had ever been. The love she experienced left marks, but it also left structure, like a house that withstood a fire and needed to be reinforced from the inside. There were still cracks, there were still memories, but now there was room for something new, even if she didn't yet know exactly what. And it was at this stage, when she no longer expected anything, but was also not empty, that destiny began, silently, to rearrange itself. The love that doesn't die no longer shouts. It changes location. At some point, she realizes she no longer waits. She doesn't look at her phone with the same urgency. She doesn't reorganize her day based on a remote possibility. She doesn't negotiate her own routine with hope. The waiting dissolves silently, without announcement, without farewell. There was no clear decision, only a deep weariness that taught the heart to stop chasing what doesn't return. Even so, the love doesn't disappear. It ceases to be expectation and transforms into something more static, less painful, yet present. She moves on, talks, works, smiles, fulfills her days. On the outside, everything seems resolved. On the inside, love has simply changed address. Now love lives as a silent memory. It no longer invades her thoughts all the time, but appears in unexpected moments. An old song, a familiar smell, a phrase spoken by a stranger. It doesn't hurt like before, but it's not neutral either. It's a memory that asks for nothing, demands no answer, doesn't demand promises. She doesn't relive scenes to suffer. She simply acknowledges that they existed and left marks. There's no constant anger, nor a need for belated explanations. There's only a discreet respect for what was lived. Love, at this stage, no longer tries to prove anything. It observes from a distance, like a closed story that still occupies an important shelf in emotional memory. The peace that arises is real, but incomplete. There's tranquility in not expecting, in not getting hurt daily, in not depending on someone's return. But there's also a subtle, almost imperceptible absence of something that was never fully replaced. She learned to live without it, learned not to hurt, learned to move on. However, some parts remain untouched, not because of suffering, but because of meaning. The love that has moved doesn't prevent new paths. It only reminds her that certain stories leave a permanent silence. It's not constant sadness, it's awareness. A peace that coexists with memory, an emotional maturity that understands that not everything needs to continue to have been true. Love hasn't died. He simply learned to exist without presence. What she didn't know was that, while the absence grew on her side, His life continued down paths that were never visible from a distance. There was no silence of indifference, but of circumstances that accumulated too quickly. Days that began to crumble, responsibilities that arose without warning, problems that demanded immediate and solitary decisions. He also woke up with the weight of the promise on his head, but now surrounded by choices that didn't allow for simple explanations. His life didn't stop when he left. It became more complicated, and each obstacle faced was carried in silence because admitting fragility seemed impossible. For her, it was absence. For him, it was emotional survival in a scenario that changed with every step. There were obstacles she could never see, fears that were not shared, situations that couldn't be contained in quick messages, dilemmas that demanded more than courage. He knew that explaining would mean admitting that he might not be able to keep his promise, and that paralyzed him. Each day without contact increased the distance, but also the shame. How could he return after so long? How could he justify the silence without seeming weak or inconsistent? Difficult decisions piled up, and none seemed right. Speaking hurt, and staying silent hurt too. The guilt grew precisely because the feeling still existed. It wasn't a lack of love. It was an excess of emotional weight without knowing how to share it. Sometimes two people are suffering from the same promise, on opposite sides of the same road. While she learned to cope with the absence, he struggled with his own inability to return as he had imagined. The promise remained alive in both their minds, but manifested itself in different ways. For her, as waiting and pain. For him, as failure and silence. Neither side saw the other completely, only the void left between them. This is the point where the story begins to reverse, not to deny the suffering, but to reveal that not all distance stems from a lack of feeling. Some distance stems from the fear of not being enough to fulfill what was promised. The encounter happens without warning, like everything that truly changes something inside. It wasn't planned, it wasn't sought, it just happened in a place laden with meaning. One of those places that hold memories even when they seem ordinary. A space where the past still breathes, even if no one talks about it. When their eyes meet, time slows down for a few seconds, too long to be ignored. There's no emotional preparation, no shield. The body reacts before the mind. The heart races, breathing falters, thoughts become jumbled. Everything that was repressed for months returns all at once. It's not joy, it's not pure pain, it's impact. A silent clash between what was lived and what was never resolved. The silence that forms between them is heavy, dense, almost palpable. Neither of them knows which word would be safe enough to break it. Any phrase would seem insufficient, too late, or too dangerous. There's a desire to speak, but also fear of what might be said. Silence then becomes an involuntary choice. It carries unspoken apologies, questions never asked, answers that may never come. The surrounding environment continues normally. People pass by, sounds exist, but their everything seems suspended. It's not an empty silence. It's a silence laden with stories. It says, "I missed you." It says, "I suffered." It says, "I didn't know how to come back." It says everything at once without uttering a single sound. The glances end up saying more than any explanation could. There is recognition, there is guilt, there is still present care. It's not the gaze of strangers, but it's also no longer the gaze of someone who belongs. It's an uncomfortable middle ground, where the old love still recognizes itself, but no longer knows where to fit in. Each second sustained in that gaze reveals truths that were never verbalized. She understands that he also carried weight. He realizes that she learned to survive without answers. Neither of them wins this moment. Both are traversed by it. The unexpected encounter doesn't resolve the story, but it breaks the illusion of forgetting. It proves irreversibly that certain connections don't disappear. They just wait for the exact moment to remember that they still exist. The truth finally finds its place when silence can no longer bear the weight of what has been kept hidden. The explanations don't come organized nor perfect. They emerge fragmented, laden with hesitation, long pauses, and deep breaths. He speaks of what happened, of what he couldn't say, of the fear of appearing weak, of the panic of admitting he had no control over his own life at that moment. There is no attempt to fully justify himself, only to be honest. Each word spoken seems late, but necessary. It's not an ordinary conversation. It's an emotional outpouring accumulated over months. The truth doesn't come to erase the pain, it comes to give it form. For the first time, what was once silence takes on a human, imperfect, and vulnerable shape. The request for forgiveness is not theatrical. It doesn't seek immediate absolution. It comes laden with awareness, a clear recognition that the silence hurt, that the absence left real marks. Asking for forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it changes the weight of the present. She listens in silence because the pain that needed to be heard wasn't just his. Hers also needed to exist in that space. She speaks of what she felt, of the abandonment, of the nights of waiting, of the unjust guilt she carried alone. Each sentence spoken functions as an emotional release. There are no interruptions, no defenses. She just listens. The pain, when finally acknowledged, loses some of its poison. It doesn't disappear, but it ceases to be invisible. It is at this point that the greater truth is revealed, not as an excuse, but as human understanding. Not all absence is a lack of love. Sometimes it's an excess of fear. Fear of failing, fear of not keeping promises, fear of disappointing. What separated them was not the absence of feeling, but the inability to deal with it. This realization doesn't fix everything, but it changes the meaning of what was experienced. The story ceases to be just about abandonment and becomes about human fragility. Catharsis isn't about the happy ending or immediate reconciliation, but about the profound relief of finally understanding. When the truth is told, the heart doesn't go back to being the same. It matures, and, at that moment, that's enough to breathe again. After the truth is told, immediate relief doesn't come, but rather the weight of the choice. Forgiving or protecting oneself ceases to be an abstract question and becomes a concrete, intimate, silent decision. She understands that hearing the explanations doesn't erase what she lived through, just as forgiveness doesn't guarantee future security. The heart, still sensitive, recognizes the affection that hasn't died, but the mind precisely remembers the emotional cost of waiting. It's not a choice between love and anger. It's a choice between repeating a risk or respecting one's own limits. The past demands a chance. The present demands care. And she finds herself exactly in the middle of this conflict, where any decision involves loss. The emotional risk is now real, palpable, without romanticization. Going back would mean reopening spaces that took time to heal. It would mean trusting someone who, even unintentionally, caused deep pain. Protecting oneself, on the other hand, requires renouncing the possibility of a fresh start with someone who still matters. There is no safe path. There are no guarantees. She understands that emotional maturity isn't about choosing what hurts less, but about consciously accepting the price of one's own decision. Fear exists on both sides, but now it doesn't control her. For the first time, she doesn't decide driven by blind hope, nor by neediness, nor by the fear of losing. She decides with clarity, even trembling. Her choice isn't naive, it's lucid. Whatever path she takes, she knows what she's doing. If she forgives, it won't be by forgetting the past, but by establishing new boundaries. If she walks away, it won't be out of pride, but out of self-love. The tension of this moment isn't in what she chooses, but in the fact that now she chooses for herself. There's no promise supporting the decision, no external expectation. There's only awareness. And this is the most difficult choice because it demands taking responsibility for one's own heart. Regardless of the outcome, something has already changed definitively. She has stopped waiting for someone else to decide for her. The happy ending doesn't arrive as a perfect story. It's born from a conscious construction. The love that returns isn't the same as it was before the absence because now it carries scars, memories, and maturity. There's no idealization, no rush to recover lost time, no illusions about perfection. there's a daily choice. The reunion doesn't erase what hurt, but redefines what can exist from then on. They no longer rely on grandiose promises, but on real presence. Love is rebuilt in the details, difficult conversations that aren't avoided, silences that are now explained, boundaries respected without emotional negotiation. It's not a love that depends on the future to exist. It's a love that sustains itself in the present, with awareness of everything that was almost lost. The promises, once fragile, are now sustained by visible actions. There's no need to repeat words that have already failed in the past. Commitment manifests itself in consistency, in coherent choices, in actions that don't disappear when difficulties arise. What was once expectation becomes security, built little by little. They understand that loving is not guaranteeing the absence of pain, but guaranteeing emotional responsibility. The bond is not strengthened by fear of losing, but by a desire to care. Each step is taken with attention, because both know the price of silence and distance. Love is no longer proven with speeches, but with permanence. It is at this point that the relationship ceases to be a promise and becomes practice. Destiny didn't err, it just took its time. The time that separated them was not wasted, it was preparation. Separated, they learned the value of what they had. Together again, they learned not to repeat what almost destroyed everything. The story doesn't end as it began, it ends better because it is more truthful. Some stories don't end when they seem to end. They simply pause, waiting for the people involved to mature enough to live them in the right way. A realistic happy ending lies not in the absence of conflict, but in the ability to face it together. And when that happens, love ceases to be a fragile promise and becomes a solid choice, made every day. In the end, this story isn't about wasted time, it's about revealing time. Love isn't about the perfect moment, about everything working out right the first time, or about flawless encounters. True love exposes what wasn't ready yet. It lays bare immaturities, fears, unresolved silences, and unrealistic expectations. Time doesn't separate out of cruelty. It separates to show. To show who runs away when things get tough, who stays silent when they should speak, who promises before understanding the cost of staying. Only after absence do many understand the value of presence. And only after pain does love cease to be fantasy and become emotional responsibility. Emotional maturity isn't about loving without fear. It's about loving knowing the risks. It's understanding that deep feelings demand equally deep actions. Not all waiting is in vain, because some teach, strengthen, and prepare. But not every promise deserves to be waited for, because words without emotional support become silent traps. Learning the difference between healthy hope and self-abandonment is one of the greatest acts of self-love. Waiting isn't wrong. What's wrong is getting lost while waiting. Worthwhile love doesn't demand that someone diminish themselves, blame themselves, or erase themselves. It grows together or it doesn't. This story ends by reminding us of something essential. Destiny doesn't work in haste. It works with preparation. It brings closer, distances, silences, and returns only when there is enough awareness to sustain what is asked. Destiny doesn't make mistakes, but it tests who is truly ready. Ready to stay, ready to care, ready not to run away when love ceases to be easy. And whoever understands this carries a truth for a lifetime. Some stories only survive because they went through the right time, through the right pain, and through the necessary maturity to finally truly exist. If this story lingered silently within you for a few extra seconds, it wasn't by chance. Stories like this don't demand attention. They acknowledge experiences. They resonate with those who have waited too long, who held on to promises as a last thread of hope, who felt time pass while their hearts stood still. Perhaps you haven't lived this exact story, but you recognized emotions, thoughts, long nights, and unanswered questions. When something touches you like this, it's because there's identification. And identification is the most honest way a story can say, you weren't the only one, you're not alone, and what you felt was real. Now, answer honestly, not to me, but to yourself. Have you ever waited for someone who promised to return? Have you ever defended absences, justified silences, believed more in words than in actions? If this question resonated with you, write the word "weighted" in the comments. It's not exposure, it's recognition. Sometimes, naming your own story is the first step to understanding what it truly meant. When you comment, you transform silence into voice and realize that other people also carry similar chapters. And if you want to continue listening to stories that don't skim the surface, that speak of what is almost never said aloud, subscribe to the channel. Here, each story exists to touch where no one sees, where few words reach, but where many feelings live. Turn on notifications. Stay tuned. Some stories don't appear when we look for them. They arrive when we are ready to hear them. If you want a second story based on this one, write Part 2 in the comments.